October 25, coming to you live from the sunny, muddled east, where, as I said yesterday, we'll see whether or not Trump gives the Hamas until Sunday, or maybe a little bit less time, maybe until then. Who knows? We'll see. And indeed, in the recent hours, I think it was about, well, it was at some point yesterday, Trump did in fact say that he was giving them until Sunday to make their decision as to whether or not they would accept the proposal that currently lays out the 20 points as a plan to end the war and begin moving forward with the peace plan and all that kind of thing. Apparently, the Hamas has said that they could give up their weapons if a Palestinian group takes over Gaza after they leave power, as opposed to an international group. That may be a sticking point that they want to negotiate. I mean, that is something they said they want to negotiate already. And apparently also they want to be fully involved if and when there is a state called Palestine that will be recognized, including by Israel, and actually become a real state. So that will probably be a sticking point as well, because Israel clearly does not want Hamas to be involved in the future of Palestinian politics. And by the way, neither does the Palestinian Authority, and neither does Qatar, at least on paper, and neither do all these other groups, the Saudis and many other nations, Indonesia, that signed off on this plan, including the European Union, by the way, and the United States. So they've all said Palestine cannot have Hamas be in control. It cannot be a state that has Hamas in control, and they would object to that. So that is my point of obvious, pointing out the failure of the agreement as it is currently sitting. It could change, sure. It could possibly be the case that they will ameliorate their stance and accept it, but I wouldn't be waiting up nights. It is something that is very unlikely to see a significant change on the part of the Palestinians. They do not seem prone to want to accept that kind of a deal that would see them fully removed from power, even though they say they're okay with the idea for now. They've obviously shown they're not so okay with it by making that demand that they would inevitably be involved in running a Palestinian state in the future. So as long as that is a sticking point, even if they say on paper that they accept it, the details matter. And if they're going to insist on being part of a future Palestinian state, well, then this deal is kind of dead in the water before it starts, because Israel has made it very clear. And by the way, for now anyway, the other signatories to this deal, which include their main sugar daddy, Qatar, right? Palestinian or Hamas's main sugar daddy, for now, they've all signed on to this agreement, which means for now they support the notion that Hamas will not be involved in a future state of Palestine. Now, does that mean that Hamas cannot just transform itself, change its political name, change its group name, and suddenly be accepted by these other groups? Of course they can. It's probably the oldest trick in the book, and we saw ISIS do that, right, with this guy Giuliani, who literally just disassociated a chunk of the ISIS members from the group officially, and then just declared that he was no longer a jihadi and put on a suit, and somehow that convinced a lot of people in the West that he's not a jihadi because he has a new group name, And he said that he's not a jihadi anymore, and he wears a suit now, and he shaved his beard a little bit to look, cameragenic for Western audiences. And in doing so, Jelani pulled a fast one over the world. Right? He is welcome. He's been welcomed at the Élysée Palace in Paris. He's been welcomed by meeting President Trump. He's been welcomed by any number of heads of state who have now shaken his hand and said they intend to support his regime, despite the fact that his regime has already involved itself in multiple mass slaughters of people, including attempted genocide in Soweto against the Kurds, and also various horrible attacks against the Alawites. He humiliated and mass murdered, well, his troops did. And it's been absolutely a terrible time to be an ethnic minority in Syria the past 10 months or so, 9 months since they took over. So, yes, there have been some moments of hope and anticipation for better times, but there's also been plenty of days where there's been absolutely horrible violence against people who are just, trying to live their life peacefully and end up getting slaughtered because they don't believe in the same God as someone else, which is just insane. So it just goes to show how much impressions matter and how much impressions can change, and what kind of simple changes can radically affect an entire nation's perception in the eyes of the world, or at least the perception of its leadership, and how good its diplomatic reach can be turned very quickly, how well it can be turned very quickly. And yeah, so that is my that's my forecast for the current situation, is that they will probably do something similar in that capacity to have a similar impact on the perception that people and nations and diplomats have of them. So, don't be surprised to see Western diplomats quickly lining up to shake hands with whoever will be the new leader of the Hamas derivative that would take over Gaza if such a plan would be allowed. Of course, Israel understands this concept, right? The leadership in Israel certainly knows that that's exactly what Hamas is going to try to do. And that's why they're going to try with all they can to stop such a thing from happening. But the probability of stopping such an attempted change actually decreases as time goes by, and that's exactly why Hamas is playing the hand of time, trying to outlast, run out the clock, so to speak, run out Trump's patience, and then just when he says, Israel, do what you want, they'll say, no, we accept the plan, and they'll try to basically blame it on the West that the plan fell through, even though it's Hamas's fault. And we will probably see more continued fighting until Hamas will then demand that the same peace plan, be put in place after the rest of the world has already said, well, we gave you that last chance and now you don't have it anymore. And then they'll cry more genocide, etc., because, again, they failed to accept the plan now. Right? They're just going to twist and turn the tables. That's always what they do. So, if they are continuing to receive support financially and otherwise from Qatar and from Iran, it's very easy to imagine that the political leaders of Hamas will say, nope, we're going to keep fighting. If they've actually stopped receiving as much support from at least Qatar, if not from Iran also, then they are very likely to say, uh, that they're continuing, that they're going to seek to end it, right? And that they're going to be looking for some kind of resolution to the conflict, right? But what's the reality? Are they actually going to look for an end to the conflict, or are they going to just use that as an excuse to continue in a different way? That's my bet. Right? Why? Because, well, I don't trust them, obviously. um, you know, it would be a bit foolish to just believe whatever the Hamas says when their backs are to the wall, they're cornered, they know they've got nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Yes, they hold hostages. Some suspect 20 of them are alive. Maybe it's more, by the way. We don't know. And they could make horrific actions to the last 20 hostages or however many hostages that are alive. So Israel is trying everything it can to avoid that, but at the same time, if Israel is fighting this war full press against the remaining Hamas terrorists in Gaza City, there is a high probability that some, if not all, of those hostages will die. And that is a very terrible cost to pay that Israel does not want to have happen. But obviously, the risk analysis is something that every military calculates whenever it takes military action. What is the risk reward analysis from their point of view? Is it more important to destroy Hamas and get them out of power, or more important to get the hostages all back? Of course, you want to say both. Yeah, sure. But rarely ever does the math line itself up so that you get both things, right? Yeah, it has happened in history. Israel got back pretty much all of the hostages from Entebbe in 1976. Did lose about 4 hostages, and the operations leader, Yonatan Netanyahu, Bibi's brother, right? But apart from that, and yes, there have been some other cases, the Sabina airplane, and some other occurrences where anti-terror forces were able to get rid of the terrorists and bring back all the hostages. But overall, when you are fighting terrorists who are holding hostages, it is inevitable, statistically, it's practically inevitable uh, that somebody will, again, even in Entebbe, right? Hostages did die, not a huge amount, but still, hostages did die, and the operations commander did die. So there's always a risk reward analysis, and you're barely ever going to get exactly what you want if you're fighting the terrorists, right? There's always going to be an unfortunate price to probably have to pay. So that is a very difficult calculation, and I'm not saying that Israel should put the hostages in greater risk. I'm not saying that. Okay. I understand people want to win this war outright, but you also have to see it from the point of view of the families who would do anything to get their family members back. And I know we can all point to Yahya Sinwar and say this guy was a captive in Israeli prisons. His life was saved by the Israeli medical system that gave him um, medical care when he needed it when he was in Israeli prisons, and they saved him from a brain cancer or brain tumor or whatever. And he ended up planning and launching the attacks of October 7th, and included in that was the murder of one of the children of one of the doctors that saved his life. And he was released. Remember, when he had been captured, he'd been released for, he was one of 1,000 or roughly 1,000 Palestinians that were released in exchange for one Israeli, Gilad Shalit, the soldier who had been captured in Gaza and held for years and years, and was eventually released for 1,000 Palestinians, which again included Yahya Sinwar and many other horribly violent people who had committed acts of murder against Palestinians, by the way, as well as against Israelis. Yahya Sinwar was actually in Israeli prisons because of the violence he committed against Palestinians in Gaza. Right? So, keep that in mind. He is hardly an innocent person. The man has had a lot of blood on his hands, including Palestinian blood, mainly Palestinian blood. So that's why when Israel does its risk reward calculations, it's a very serious thing because we are fully aware of the massive danger that is posed to every single hostage every inch that Israel makes progress in fighting against Hamas in Gaza. And especially now that, the IDF suspects that many of those hostages have been moved around, even sometimes above ground, and maybe used as human shields in the current fighting. Which is an indicator that surely Israeli intelligence, officials are taking into account and determining exactly whether or not they should be doing whatever they're doing in any particular instance. It's not easy. They can't just demolish everything in sight. I know people like to say, "Oh, they're just destroying all of Gaza City." Actually, they're not. Like, yeah, they're destroying a lot of things, but each thing they're destroying is a very specific target. And sure, sometimes there is, the blast radius will do more damage to things, and sometimes, unfortunately, to people, because blast radius is not contained exactly within the square foot that you're trying to blast when you're shooting, a bomb from an airplane or, a rocket, shoulder fired rocket type of weapon or something like that, or cannons or whatever it might be that the IDF might be shooting at them. So, because of that, Israel is in very much of a quandary. Can it just continue to fight the war? Or is it going to be a situation where Israel's hands are basically tied because they really can't keep pushing forward any longer? And of course, sure, kinetically, we know Israel can win the war. That's not a question, right? That isn't the question. The question is Israel willing to pay the price of potentially losing all of the living hostages and maybe never getting back any of the remaining hostages, dead or alive, because of what the Hamas may do to. Hello there. I say hi. I say hi to you, to all of you. Hi, hi, hi. Shalom, shalom, shalom. The question is whether or not Israel is willing to pay the price to actually win the war, meaning to get Hamas out of power and get them to surrender and free the hostages. And I would be lying if I would say it's going to be an easy job to get done. If they have to fight it, it'll be much easier, much less violent if Hamas would in fact accept the peace plan. But think about it. Ideologically, since 1988, when Hamas was formed, their strategy has always been, and remains to this day, to use violence in order to get to their end goal, which is to destroy the state of Israel, kill all of its inhabitants, Jews and otherwise, and until their very recent change in their charter, kill all the Jews around the world, and by the way, also all the infidels and hypocrites, as they call them, anyone who doesn't believe in their particular version of God, right? Yeah, they may have changed the words of their charter, but it doesn't change the fact that that's still their end goal. They want the world to be dominated by a worldwide Muslim caliphate that they envision, which is an extremist jihadi version of Islam, which actually I keep arguing it's not even extremist, unfortunately. It's actually a literalist interpretation. And that's kind of the problem, is that they're being literal. They're not being extreme. And that means that the actual extremists, right, are the outliers who are not following their creed, But the extremists are the ones who are saying, no, let's do things differently. Let's try to reform. That's actually considered extremism in Islam, because reforming is banned, is forbidden in Islam. You cannot reform the religion according to strict interpretations of it, like literal interpretations. So, because to them it's a perfect document, it can never be changed, blah blah blah. There is no changing it whatsoever. Look, Judaism was also, enshrined in rock, except that we always had the ability to question it and to update it, and we did multiple times. Christianity also was enshrined in rock until it wasn't, right? It was also firmly in place and never going to be changed until it actually was changed. So what does that tell you? Well, that tells you, the other two main Abrahamic religions, the first two, have changed and adapted to modern times. And that has served both of them very well. And it has served the world well overall. Yes, there have been many terrible things done since they have reformed and all this stuff. I get it. But nevertheless, if you look at the big arc of history, and you can say the conflicts keep getting bigger to some degree, but actually since World War II, the conflicts have been getting smaller. Yes, there are more conflicts, but they are smaller. And some of them, unfortunately, last a very long time because of the nature of how those conflicts are now fought. But overall, conflicts impacting the world have become smaller, and the number of casualties are smaller. And in the big arc of history, things are improving for humanity as people realize we can get along without fighting, right? Now, sure, there are still 60 parties involved in wars right now, right? There's still more than 30 active wars in the world right now. You can look that up online, by the way. It's not a secret, right? And that means that, what is that? Roughly, more than a quarter of the world is involved in conflict in terms of the number of countries and stuff, right? More than, it's a huge amount of people. Now, in some cases, like Israel is involved in multiple wars because it's fighting the Houthis in Yemen, it's fighting the Hamas in Gaza, it's fighting the Hezbollah in Lebanon, it's fighting the, all these different Iran and on all that sort of thing. But, in most cases, it's just one country fighting another one. So there's, roughly 25 or more countries actually fighting with each other. No, sorry, more than that. There's like 55 or so countries fighting with each other, involved in more than 30 wars, which is kind of crazy. Out of like 200 plus or minus countries, depending on how you want to calculate or count countries, right? But nations, people, groups, whatever. There's, some 60 wars. 60 wars, 30 or so wars happening out of like 55 different people groups. So that is another part of the calculus, by the way, of what Hamas does, because they are very, excuse me, Hamas is very, very, very aware of their public position in the media. What does that say? Hi. They're very aware of their public PR position, right? Yes, you can say they're idiots. They've done a lot of foolish things. It's true. They act like monsters and something. It's true. When it comes to media and PR, unfortunately for Israel, Hamas has kind of outplayed Israel in many ways for a long time. They've done that through their partnership with Qatar and Al Jazeera and all kinds of different influence around the world that they've been gifted by Qatar and other countries, and Iran, of course. So they understand very well how to optimize their position in the PR book, in the PR space, right? They're not fools to this. They understand very well how to be seen, how to be perceived as the good guys when they're clearly not. They understand how to be seen as David when they are literally a very shrewd and dangerous part of the Goliath that is the masses of the Arab world and the Muslim world that are virulently against Israel. And you can tell me, well, it's only 10% of the Arab or Muslim world that are against Israel. Okay, if it's just 10% of the Arab world, that's somewhere between 400 and 500 million people. 10% of that is somewhere between 40 and 50 million people. That's like 5 times the size of Israel's population, just in terms of those who are angry and violent in the Arab world. If you calculate 10% of the Muslim world, there's 2 billion people roughly in the Muslim world. So we're talking 200 million people who are potentially and probably violent, angry Muslims who would do something if they could to fight against Israel. That's more than 20 times the entire population of Israel. 200 million people, right? Israel has roughly 10 million people, a bit less even. So we're talking about huge numbers against which Israel is poised, and faces. And you can say, well, they're just citizens, they're not actually going to do anything. Again, we're talking about the 10% that support the violence and that would probably do something if they could, like violently. So this is, again, part of Hamas's calculation. They know Israel's a tiny little country. Yes, we fight strong and we fight well, and we have relatively a lot of resources given our size, but we are still tiny in number compared to the enemies that we face. Yes, we may have more advanced weapons, we may have more whatever. They have numbers. They could try to do a meat grinder style invasion of Israel, the likes of which Russia is trying to do in Ukraine. And then you have to remember, Israel is a lot smaller than Ukraine. And sure, Russia is the biggest country on earth and has a couple 100 million people by itself, and has the second largest military in the world, or did at the beginning of this war with Ukraine anyway. So they could easily attempt, to meat grind away at Ukraine and slowly gain land over time in Ukraine and still not take all of Ukraine. The land that Russia has taken from Ukraine is already far bigger than all the land of Israel. Right? So an army that could potentially be twice the size of the Russian army, made up of all kinds of different Arab countries and Muslim countries, if they were to coordinate, a one-time attack or whatever, could present a serious problem, which is why it's incredibly important that Israel maintain qualitative advantage over its enemies, because there is always that risk. And then people say, well, Israel has nukes. Of course they're safe. Israel has never actually officially acknowledged that they have nukes, but even if some top leaders have said some things here and there, well, if they do have it, well, thank goodness, because maybe that will deter its enemies from trying anything stupid. And if they don't have it, well, it's good that their enemies maybe believe it, that they do, because maybe that is the only qualitative edge that they might be able to hold is a deceit. And if that's as it is, if that keeps the peace, so be it. But we have to remember, Israel is facing extremely violent enemies. Hamas is just one of them, and Hamas will probably cease to be its worst threat if this agreement is accepted, which is yet another reason why Hamas has yet to accept this agreement. They don't want to be a former headache for Israel. They want to be a consistent headache for Israel, and they want to eventually destroy it, right? So that means that they need, if they're going to stay relevant, they need to find some way to do that. And if they outright accept this deal as it is, they kind of lose relevance, especially if it is followed up relatively quickly by, I think, something like an expansion of the Abraham Accords, right? If Qatar joins the Abraham Accords, that would basically spell disaster for Hamas, right? And if Saudi does a peace deal with Israel as part of the Abraham Accords, or separately or whatever, that would also be the end of not just Hamas, but the entire Sunni Arab world's claim against Israel, effectively. right? If they get a a proclamation from the head, whoever wears the big turban in that society, they would say, or headdress or whatever he wears, um, whoever the religious top dog is in Sunni Islam, that would basically end the conflict, right? You could say the war's over. The religious war is over. We're not fighting the Jews anymore, and that would be it. And then there would be no more grounds that are justifiable for Sunni groups to keep fighting as top religious leaders said so. Now, of course, you can say, well, they have many splinter groups. Yeah, they do have many splinter groups. But if the very top one orders it down, you can order it down to subordinates. And if they disagree, then they got beef with their top dog. And that ceases to be an Israel problem as much. It still would be, but it ceases to be an Israel problem as much as a intra-Islam problem, intra-Muslim, whatever you want to call it, intramural Muslim issue, which then is something that they would need to completely deal with, and actually that could trigger much needed reforms, as I said earlier. But will that happen? As I say time and again, it might happen, but I ain't waiting up nights. Right? This is something that could take a short time. It's something that could take a very long time. And whatever amount of time it takes, we will see exactly not how long it will take only, but also what, if any, change happens in the region and around the world as a result. Because certainly, if something like this would happen, it would have a significant impact on the entire planet in terms of relationships between nations. Because if there's no more Israel to fight, then all their poisons will slip out. They will be fighting against each other. If they have any unresolved beef, and many countries and peoples do, right, their convenient scapegoat of Israel will cease to be such a convenient scapegoat. They will be, at each other's throats for the foreseeable future until they resolve their own disputes. That could take a short time or a long time. And hopefully it will be a shorter time rather than a longer time. But, we're still probably, my guess is anywhere from 50 to 500 years, maybe less, 50 to, let's say, 250. All major interhuman conflicts are resolved. Now, why do I have such an optimistic view that we could ever possibly get all human major conflicts resolved? Well, look, technology is changing the world. And we are seeing massive effects about that happening. We are seeing, for example, the possibility that something like AI could rapidly change, that not only will technology replace people's jobs, if not everyone's jobs, but that we will have a completely different kind of economy, one which is based and driven by AI and robots. And sure, you'll still have people maybe coming up with business ideas and building businesses and owning businesses, but they're going to be basically managing a bunch of robots for the most part. You can always tell me, yeah, but doctors you can't replace, anything with a human touch you can't replace. Listen, that's true for now. But there may come a time when doctors are trusted more than, robot doctors are trusted more than human doctors. Personally, I don't think I ever want to trust a robot doctor more than a human doctor. But it doesn't mean that I couldn't envision myself being a patient of a doctor who uses robots. Plumber is also going to be hard to replace, right? Until the plumbers can actually be robots, but it'll eventually happen. We already use robotics in some aspects of plumbing, but wait until they're autonomous. There are all kinds of different things that the world is not ready for, hasn't conceived yet, of the inevitable change of work, the nature of work, the nature of the economy, of how things are done. Like, there are a lot of jobs that people think are safe today that are going to be replaced by AI. And it's not going to be replaced by the kind of AI you're using today, asking it to write you an article. Those jobs are already affected, okay? And they're going to continue to be affected increasingly. I'm talking about the jobs like nurse, social worker, daycare person, doctor, electrician, you know, carpenter, whatever, sailor, all kinds of different jobs that we think we need human beings for. And currently we do. Deep sea diver, whatever it might be, right? We got robotic versions of all these things already. They're just not fully advanced yet, and they can't do everything that a human can do. But wait until they can. And if you're going to tell me, oh, they'll never be able to do that, just look at videos from the past couple of years. Not generative AI video quality, because sure, that's improved a lot too. But I'm talking about videos of robots in the past couple of years and how much they've advanced just since the popularization of large language models 2, 3 years ago. Consider how far they've come. You really don't think that robots are going to be even more advanced in another 2, 3 years? You think they just keep advancing at the same pace or at an increased pace, which is always what technology does, right? It doubles the speed of its improvements every 18 months, roughly, right? Moore's law. It works in potential productivity as well as in CPU power. Number of circuits we can fit into the same, volume of space. And so when you consider that, we are looking at a very changed world in the future, and that is something that a group like Hamas dreads. What happens when they no longer have an old world purpose of just being violent for the sake of some crazy ideology that is anachronistic and doesn't fit in the modern world that we live in at all? Sure, I know there's college kids now who are all anti-Israel and the Zionists and all that BS. Just another name for anti-Semitism. And yes, I realize there will probably be anti-Semitism for a long time to come. It will probably be one of the last conflicts, if not the last conflict, between humans because of the nature of people. But at the same time, as a Jew and somebody who's Israeli, among other things, as an American, as a French person, somebody who believes in freedom, and somebody who has hope, I think there is always hope that one day we will see the end of these human conflicts. It just may take a very long time. And we, in this living generation, we may not live to see it, that the world will all be at peace. That's true. We'll never live to see that. But also we might. Right? We actually might see a drastic reduction in violence among nations if this war between Israel and Hamas can be brought to an end relatively soon. If that were to happen, we would definitely be looking at an era of some peace and prosperity among nations that had been fighting each other for a very, very, very long time. That's ultimately why I remain very hopeful that not only we can reach a deal with Hamas, but that we will. Because at the end of the day, yeah, I know they're ideologically crazy psychopaths. I get that. The Nazis were too. And yes, the Nazis were in power a lot less long of a time, excuse me, than the Islamic world has been in a state of jihad since the days of Muhammad, because technically speaking, the world isn't all yet Muslim, therefore the world is still in a state of jihad since his time. But as much as we've been in a long struggle dealing with Islam's refusal to change over the last 1400 plus years, from a strict interpretation point of view, of course, yes. And I realize most Muslims are not strict interpretationalists of Islam, and that's why they are mostly not crazy ideologues. But it's the 10% that are the problem that we need to worry about, as I mentioned. As much as they've been in that anachronistic fight for centuries now, when they should have been getting with the times, and instead they've just been getting more extreme, thinking they can just go back to the old ways of doing things, there is also the probability that they will adapt very quickly to a new reality because of the rate of change, because of the speed of information, because once they are forced to accept that change, the Muslim world will rapidly evolve into a new era. And one can only hope that will be a positive one. And I do remain hopeful that it will be a positive one. As much as I realize, I know the risk is enormous that they will not. But here's the thing. There's that old magic trick, if you want to call it that, of multiple choices. When you're given multiple choices, it is statistically in your favor to, if you're given the choice to pick what's behind door number A, door letter A, door letter B, or door letter C, that it's statistically in your favor to change. Whatever they give you first, change. And if they give you the opportunity to change again. Because the probability is that you will get a better prize after one change and an even better one after two changes. In that same, maybe naive hope, it's not really naive, but in that same optimistic, cautious optimistic hope, I remain hopeful that we will find a way to end this insane conflict, which I've always called the most stupid and pointless and unnecessary conflict on Earth, because it is. You have one side bent on destroying the other, and the other wants nothing more than to live at peace with the one side that's attacking it. The irony is insane. And the side that's trying to do the destruction, that aims to do the destruction, and it says it publicly, is the side that has the very smallest probability of kinetic success in the way they're currently conducting it. And the side that wants peace is doing most of the destruction because they have the kinetic ability to do so, and they also have the political support of the main actors that give it the support that it needs to do so, despite the fact that it would do so anyway because it's in its own interest, etc. And it's the right thing to do, even if it's an awful thing to do, which is to keep prosecuting a war. But if you don't destroy or remove from power the enemy that is bent destroying you, you're just asking for more destruction and death in the future from that same enemy. So why would anybody do that? Why would anybody in their right mind? Good luck naming me even one country that would willingly accept being attacked over and over and over and over again if they know that the enemy is planning to do that to them and they have the ability to wipe out that enemy. They would just wipe out that enemy in any other normal country. And nobody would say a damn thing about it if they had the ability to actually wipe them out. For example, just look at the Philippines. Do you think if the Philippines had the ability to actually wipe out all of the Muslim extremists that are threatening the peace and stability of their country, if they actually had that ability in the Filipino military, do you think they wouldn't just do that? They 100% would, and they've tried many times, but they can't. That's why they don't do it. It's not because they don't want to. It's just because they can't for any number of reasons. And I can point you to any country that's having a conflict between two parties or more and say the same exact thing. The only reason those wars don't end is because one side doesn't actually have the ability to really end it. For example, Saudi Arabia and the Houthis. Why doesn't Saudi Arabia just annihilate the Houthis? Because they can't. It's not because they don't want to.
Why don't the Houthis annihilate Saudi Arabia? Because they can't. It's not because they don't want to. So for that very reason, I remain hopeful, cautiously optimistic, but fully grounded in the reality that there is a very high probability that Hamas will refuse this deal in one way or another, either by refusing it outright or pretending to accept it and then breaking the deal in some way. They will find some kind of loophole, they will find some kind of reason to not fully accept this deal. Even if they get to a stage where they release most or even all of the hostages, I doubt very much that they're going to actually accept giving up their weapons. Even if they accept leaving power, by the way. They may accept leaving power and going back to being just a good old-fashioned jihadist Islamic extremist terrorist group with no hand in government for the time being. They may do that. But I find it very hard to believe that they will actually accept giving up all of their weapons unless, in fact, they have lost all support from Qatar and even significantly enough from Iran that they can't actually afford to continue. And their billionaire leaders will just see that the game is up. They should just go live their life in retirement and put their jihad nonsense behind them. What will happen, like I said, time will tell. If you want to stay tuned and to the kind of insights that I share, the kind of opinions I share, and you can see obviously when I prognosticate things that are likely to happen, unfortunately, very often that is what happens. Just like I did with the deadline of Trump, and I said, don't be surprised to see it go till Sunday. That's exactly what he said. So if you want, like, subscribe, comment, share, please do that for the algorithms to tell other people to also see this channel. And if you want to support me, there isn't really a way for you to do that right here. Right? That's not what I'm doing this for. Maybe at some point in the future, but certainly not here, not right now. On this video, if you want to really support me, just like and subscribe, and share and comment. That's the best thing you can do. I appreciate it very much. I hope you got something out of this. Hope you stay safe and sound and healthy and happy and prosperous. And until next time, folks, shalom.